The wind howled through the narrow streets of the small Indiana town, rattling shutters and sweeping dry leaves across the empty sidewalks. Snow clung to the corners of St. Jude's Church, layering the old stone with a cold, white silence. Inside, Father Thomas Riley stood alone, his breath visible in the dim light as he extinguished the last of the altar candles. The pews behind him stretched into shadows, rows of silent wood that had once echoed with hymns and laughter. But tonight, like most nights lately, the church was nearly empty. Fewer and fewer came to Mass. Faith was waning, and Thomas felt the weight of it like a stone in his chest. He moved slowly down the aisle, the click of his shoes on the worn tile the only sound. He reached the front door, preparing to turn the lock when, "Thomas!" A whisper, not loud, not forceful, but unmistakable. He froze. The sound came from behind him, near the altar. The name had been spoken in a woman's voice, soft and filled with something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not joy, something in between. A call, maybe even a plea. He turned, scanning the darkness of the church. The candles were out. No one was there. He stepped back toward the altar, heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing against the high-arched ceiling. "Is someone still here?" Nothing. He waited. A full minute passed. Thomas rubbed his arms. The cold seemed to have deepened, as if the air itself were holding its breath. He approached the altar again, placing a hand on its marble edge. The silence pressed in on him, thick and heavy. Had he imagined it? That name, his name spoken like that. He'd heard many voices in his time, grief-stricken parishioners, angry skeptics, broken souls, but never one like that. He felt the whisper in his bones, as though it had come from beneath the surface of the world itself. He stood there for a long moment, eyes fixed on the statue of the Virgin Mary behind the altar. Her face, serene and sorrowful, stared back at him in the dim light. "Am I losing my mind?" he whispered. Something shifted in him then, not panic, but a deep, unsettling pull, a sense that this was not random, that something, someone, had spoken on purpose, and it had chosen to speak to him. He turned off the remaining lights and locked the church, stepping out into the cold. The wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were a storm louder than the one outside. Behind him, the church stood silent, but the whisper echoed on in his mind. Thomas. If this story already sent chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button now for more gripping, real-life-inspired mysteries. He walked the short distance to the rectory, snow crunching beneath his feet. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from a deeper unrest. He'd faced spiritual doubt before. He'd counseled others through visions, grief, hallucinations. But he had always stood apart from it, always the one guiding, never the one shaken. He closed the rectory door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. His reflection stared back at him from the window. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, collar slightly askew. What was that voice? And why now? It had been almost 30 years since Emily disappeared. Since he last heard her laugh echo through this church, the pain was dormant, buried deep, until tonight. Upstairs, the old wooden floor creaked under his steps as he made his way to his study. Books lined the shelves, scripture, theology, psychology, but none offered answers. He sat at the desk, staring at nothing. The whisper hadn't been a hallucination. He knew what he'd heard. And it wasn't just a voice. It was a beginning, and something was waking up inside St. Jude's. The next morning brought no clarity. Father Thomas sat on the back pew of St. Jude's, sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows, casting fractured light over the worn floors. Dust floated lazily in the air, untouched by time or truth. His eyes were fixed on the altar, exactly where he'd heard the voice. He had slept little, his dreams fragmented and strange, silent figures in white, doors that led nowhere, and the Virgin's sorrowful gaze lingering in every corner. St. Jude's had stood for over a century. Built by immigrant hands and blessed with generations of weddings, funerals, and baptisms, it was a sacred relic in a town that had forgotten how to pray. Its pews were polished by decades of devotion now vanished, its silence louder than any sermon he'd ever preached. He rose slowly and began walking through the nave, letting his fingers trail along the wood. Every corner of this church held a memory. The baptismal font where he'd held crying infants, the confessional where broken voices whispered sins too heavy to carry alone. But there were other things too, things less spoken of. There was the candle rack by the statue of St. Joseph that sometimes burned out for no reason. The back closet near the sacristy where objects were moved, despite no one going near it. The cold draught that sometimes rushed through the vestibule, even on the hottest days. He used to dismiss these things as quirks, old building problems. But now they sat differently in his mind. He stepped into the sacristy, a small, humble space behind the altar where vestments and sacred vessels were stored. It smelled of incense and old wood. He opened a drawer, reached for the keys to the supply room and paused. They weren't there. He never moved those keys. His stomach tightened. He turned around, scanning the room. Everything seemed in place, yet something felt shifted. Behind him, a soft creak. He spun around, but nothing was there. Just the same old wooden walls, the narrow window with its cracked pane, the crucifix above the door. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not because he felt particularly holy, but because silence had begun to feel dangerous. A sound broke the stillness, metal clinking. He looked down. A small candle holder, one of the brass ones used for votive candles, lay on the floor near the altar rail. He knelt and picked it up. The wax was still warm. No one else had been inside. He held it in his hand for a long moment, then carefully placed it back. His mind reeled, flipping through explanations. Maybe it was the wind, a vibration, something loose. But no answer stuck. A flash of memory struck him. Emily, his sister, sitting near that same altar rail years ago, laughing. Her small hands folded in prayer as she mimicked him during his first Mass as an ordained priest. That was one of his last clear memories before she disappeared. He clenched his fists. God, what is this? He muttered aloud. The only reply was the groaning of the old beams above. He made his way to the rectory office and pulled out the parish archives. They were dusty and disorganized, stacks of documents, handwritten notes, faded photographs. Somewhere in this mess was the history of this place, and perhaps answers. He opened a leather-bound registry and traced the names of priests who had served before him. Men of quiet resolve, men who maybe had also heard whispers in the dark. He wouldn't dismiss it anymore. Whatever this was, it had roots deeper than just his mind. And if the church was trying to speak, he needed to listen. He stood, one hand still on the altar rail, when he felt it again. Not a voice, a presence, something watching, waiting. And as he turned slowly toward the statue of the Virgin Mary, he swore he saw her eyes, just for a second, glint with tears that hadn't been there before. The quiet inside St. Jude's was no longer just silence. It was the sound of something waking up. The wind outside had calmed, but inside St. Jude's, something restless stirred. Father Thomas moved with a cautious reverence through the nave, eyes shifting toward the empty pews. It was just past sunset. The shadows stretched long like they had something to say but never would. He lingered near the third row from the front, the one where Mrs. Eleanor Brant always sat like clockwork every Sunday morning. She was 91, nearly blind, but never missed Mass. That pew had seen more whispered prayers and trembling rosaries than any other in the church. He was about to turn away when he heard the creak, wood bending beneath invisible weight. A faint sound, like someone adjusting in their seat. He turned swiftly, but there was no one. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Hello?" he called, his voice low. No answer. He exhaled through his nose and shook his head. Perhaps he was simply exhausted. Maybe the cold was playing tricks on his senses. But the unease had grown roots inside him now, stretching into places he didn't know existed before. The next morning, he stood in the side garden of the church, pruning what little remained of the winter roses, when a voice startled him. "You've heard her too, haven't you?" He turned to see Mrs. Brant, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, leaning on her walker. Her eyes, clouded with age, were locked onto his face. Thomas cleared his throat. "Heard who?" "The woman," she said simply. "The one who walks the church when everyone's gone. The one who cries sometimes." He froze. "Mrs. Brandt. When did you hear her?" Her gloved hand trembled slightly. "Twice in the last month. Once during the rosary. I stayed after, praying for my son. And I heard her. She whispered something in Latin, I think. Couldn't understand it, but it was beautiful, terrifying too." Thomas helped her to the bench beneath the bare oak tree. "You're certain it wasn't someone else? One of the other parishioners?" She smiled, faint and dry. "You think I don't know the voices of this church? I've sat in that pew longer than you've been alive, Father." That wasn't one of us. His hands tingled with the echo of what she was saying. He wanted to ask more, so many things, but she leaned in closer. "I saw her," she whispered. "Just the edge of her gown, white, long, floating. I thought it was the Virgin." Thomas swallowed hard. "You're not the only one who's felt something. I heard a voice 2 nights ago." "Mrs. Brandt's fingers clutched the crucifix at her neck. "Then it's beginning again." He blinked. "What do you mean? Again?" But she looked away toward the church, her mouth pressed into a thin line. "You'll find out soon enough." Inside that day, the air held a charge. He lit candles slowly, as if each flame was a question. Then he sat alone in one of the back pews, closing his eyes and letting his thoughts scatter. That's when it came again. A whisper, not a word this time, but a hum, low, melodic. It moved along the walls like a breeze, brushing against the stained glass. He turned his head sharply. The melody faded. He rose, heart racing, and walked toward the altar. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood as always, her arms extended in peace, face serene. But now he noticed something new. One of the votive candles beneath her had reignited. He hadn't lit it. The wick was fresh, the flame steady. His hand hovered near it. No heat lingered from his touch. It had been lit recently. He stared at it, the quiet, overwhelming. And then he did what instinct told him. He knelt and began to pray, not for understanding, but for readiness. There was something here, not evil, not yet, but ancient, watching, testing. As he rose, he glanced back at the pews, empty. But the cushion on Mrs. Brandt's seat was indented, as though someone had just stood up. The air inside the church was unusually warm for February. Father Thomas entered St. Jude's just after dawn, intending to light candles and prepare for morning prayer, but the moment he stepped in, something halted him. A heavy scent of melted wax lingered in the air. Not from the altar. This was sharper, like dozens of candles had been extinguished all at once. He followed it instinctively, walking toward the votive rack near the Virgin Mary statue. The candle from the day before still burned, brighter now. And beneath it, on the small marble ledge, something strange caught his eye. Drips of wax, fresh, pale white, had pooled unnaturally, not random, deliberate. He leaned in, squinting. Emily. The name was clear, formed in looping trails of hardened wax, each letter shaped as though poured with care, almost reverently. Thomas staggered back. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in years. He stared at it, mind reeling. It wasn't just the name, it was the way it was written, like a memory taking form, like the church itself was trying to speak through the language of flame. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The wax was still slightly warm. He backed away and sat heavily on the nearest pew. The weight of 30 years pressed on his chest. Emily had vanished when she was only 9, a bright, sweet girl with a laugh that echoed like bells. They had searched the woods, the creeks, the town. Nothing, no body, no trace, just gone. Everyone had their theories. A stranger passing through, a tragic accident, but no closure. Not for his parents, not for him, especially not him. He rose and moved to the sacristy to splash cold water on his face. His reflection in the small mirror above the sink startled him, eyes sunken, jaw tight. He didn't recognize the fear there. Or maybe he had grown used to hiding it. A knock at the rectory door interrupted his spiral. Helen Morris stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, her nurse's uniform beneath a navy coat. She smiled gently. "Thought I'd drop off some soup. Figured you might forget to eat again." Thomas tried to smile, but it faltered. "You always know." She stepped inside, setting the thermos on the table. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." She glanced at him. "What happened?" He hesitated, then decided against lying. "I found something this morning. Wax on the Virgin's Ledge. It spelled Emily." Helen's smile vanished. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I don't know what to make of it. I didn't light that candle. I didn't pour that wax. And no one's been inside." Helen took a slow breath. "Maybe someone's trying to reach you. Or maybe she is." Thomas's voice cracked. "She's been gone for 30 years. "I know," Helen said gently, "but grief doesn't measure time. And neither does God." She reached out, touching his hand. Her warmth steadied him. "If it were me, if I saw my son's name like that, I'd listen, even if it scared me." He looked at her, searching for disbelief in her eyes, but found none. Only shared pain. Helen had lost her teenage son to a drunk driver 5 years ago. Since then, she rarely spoke about him. But the weight she carried mirrored his own. "I think something's happening here," Thomas said quietly, "and I don't know if it's divine or something else." Helen gave a small nod. "Then you don't face it alone." He held her gaze for a moment longer before she left. Alone again, Thomas returned to the church, staring at the name formed in wax. He didn't cry, but something inside him cracked. As he turned away, the candle beside the name flickered, not from a draught. It danced like it had heard everything and understood. The morning after the wax appeared, Father Thomas awoke from a dream he couldn't remember. His sheets were damp with sweat, his throat dry as ash. He rose before the sun and entered the church while the world outside was still blue and silent. He didn't light the candles this time. He didn't need them. Instead, he went straight to the sacristy. It had been bothering him, an odd draught coming from the back wall behind the statue of St. Jude, barely noticeable unless you were standing close. The wall had a false edge, a strange panel of uneven wood, something he'd glanced over 100 times but never questioned. This time he questioned everything. He ran his fingers along the paneling, pressing near the edge. A soft click responded beneath his hand, followed by a gentle shift of weight. A small section popped open, revealing a shallow recess no more than 12 inches deep. Inside was a dusty leather-bound journal, sealed with a tarnished clasp. The leather was cracked, its surface etched with age. He pulled it out gently, the scent of old paper and incense rising with it. The name on the inside cover was handwritten in faded ink. Reverend Marcus A. Bennett, St. Jude's Parish, 1963. Thomas sat at his desk in the rectory, journal open under the lamp. The entries were short, sparse, but filled with a haunted tone. Marcus Bennett had served at St. Jude's for only 3 years. He spoke of routine parish duties, baptisms, homilies, funerals, but scattered between these ordinary accounts were troubling reflections. One entry from May 1964 read, "She comes to me when I am alone, a girl in white, silent, always at the altar. Sometimes she cries, sometimes she simply stares. I tried blessing the church, but she returns." Another from September of that year, "Her name is unknown, but the sorrow she carries is real. The Virgin statue weeps when she appears. The others don't believe me. I've written the bishop. He hasn't replied." Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the pages. This was no prank, no hallucination. Someone before him had seen the same signs, felt the same fear, and it went deeper than he'd imagined. A final entry, dated January 10th, 1965, chilled him. "I heard the voice again last night. It called me by name. I fear what comes next. If I disappear, let this journal be my witness. She is not lost, she is trapped, and the church. The church is the cage." Thomas stared at the words, the room spinning slightly. He closed the journal and pressed it to his chest. There was a thread here, a history buried and ignored, and now it had chosen him. His phone buzzed. A message from Helen. Checking in on you. Let me know if you need anything. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he returned to the sacristy, replacing the panel carefully. The journal stayed with him, resting beside his bed that night. He didn't sleep much, but when he did, the dreams returned, clearer this time. A young girl in white, kneeling at the altar, whispering words he couldn't hear. And a voice so familiar it made his heart break, calling from beneath the church floor. Thomas. He woke up gasping, eyes burning with unshed tears. The sun had barely risen. He dressed slowly, the journal still clutched in his hands. Something was waiting for him inside St. Jude's, and he was done pretending not to hear it. The confessional booth in St. Jude's had always been a sanctuary of shadows, small, silent, a box of whispered sins and broken hearts. It was a place where Father Thomas had spent countless hours listening, offering absolution, praying for healing. But now it had turned into something else entirely. That morning, the light in the sanctuary flickered as he entered. The old church groaned with the shifting of cold wood and aged stone, as though it too had a soul that never quite rested. He had brought the journal with him. The last entry replayed in his mind like a loop. The church is the cage. He wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. A sign, a thread. Maybe just proof that he hadn't unraveled completely. As he stepped into the confessional to tidy up, he noticed something odd. The mirror. There wasn't supposed to be a mirror. And yet, fastened to the inside panel of the priest's side, was a small oval glass, surrounded by a thin frame of tarnished brass. Dusty, but intact. He reached out and wiped it with his sleeve, revealing a reflection that immediately stopped his breath. His own face stared back, but there was something else. A figure stood behind him. A girl. Pale. Her face blurred, her eyes dark. She didn't move. Didn't speak, just stood there. Thomas spun around. No one. The booth was empty. The door behind him was shut. He turned back to the mirror. Now it reflected only him. He stepped out quickly, heart pounding. He scanned the church. Empty. He rubbed his temples. "I'm not imagining this," he said aloud, his voice echoing softly across the sanctuary. He returned to the booth and examined the mirror. It was secured tightly, aged like it had been there for decades, but he'd never seen it before. Never. He returned to the rectory, pulled out the church blueprints, and checked the renovations. No mention of a mirror, no documentation of any installations in the confessional since 1972. He needed perspective. He called the diocese. After 2 transfers, he was connected to Bishop Caldwell's secretary. He explained the strange occurrences, omitting only the most supernatural details. His voice was calm, but beneath it trembled a raw thread of desperation. An hour later, he received a call back. "Father Riley," the bishop's voice came through, clipped and cold, "I've reviewed your request. Given your recent history, I'm advising a leave of absence." Thomas gripped the phone. "With all respect, Bishop, I'm not stepping away. There's something happening here." "And that may be exactly the problem," Caldwell replied. "Hallucinations, delusions. We've had concerns. The parish is small, dying. We understand the pressure you're under." "I'm not imagining things," Thomas said, sharper now. "There are signs, witnesses." "You're a priest," the bishop said, "not a mystic. If you're unwilling to take leave voluntarily, I'll be forced to initiate a formal review." The line went dead. Thomas stood in stunned silence, the receiver still in his hand. By the time he returned to the church, evening had fallen. The air inside was dense, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. He walked back to the confessional. The mirror was still there. He stared into it, half afraid, half hoping. The reflection stared back, and then, slowly, her face returned, just behind him. Clearer now. A girl, no older than 9. Brown hair, soft eyes. A white dress that shimmered like light through stained glass. Emily. His knees nearly gave out. He turned again. No one. But he knew now. He wasn't being haunted. He was being called. The question that had haunted him for decades pressed against his chest with unbearable clarity. Why now? Why her? And what did she want from him? The next day brought freezing rain. Grey clouds hung low over the town, and the streets shimmered with a thin layer of ice. Father Thomas stood by the window in the rectory, coffee cooling in his hand, his thoughts far from the morning's homily he was supposed to prepare. A knock on the door cut through the silence. He opened it to find a man in his mid-40s, tall, with a police badge clipped to a belt that didn't match the rest of his clothes. His brown jacket was wet from the rain, and his expression was tight with skepticism. "Greg," Thomas said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you here." Greg Harmon offered a brief nod. "Heard from Helen. Said you're seeing ghosts now." Thomas stepped aside without a word. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Greg moved to Indianapolis to join the police department. He was now a detective, and still carried the same quiet edge he'd had as a teenager, the kind that made him seem older than he was. Greg sat down at the table, pulled off his gloves. "Want to tell me what's going on?" "I don't even know where to begin." "Try." Thomas hesitated, then spoke, carefully, measured. "There have been signs, a voice, a name spelled in wax. A journal from a former priest claiming something or someone haunted this church in the 60s. Greg raised an eyebrow. "And you think this has to do with Emily?" Thomas exhaled sharply. "The name in wax was hers. I saw her reflection in the confessional mirror. She hasn't aged, Greg. You sure you're not just exhausted? I mean, come on, man." "It's been 30 years. I know what I saw." Greg leaned back, arms crossed. "You're asking me to reopen a case that's colder than the ice outside. There was no evidence then, and there's no body now." "I'm not asking you to reopen anything officially," Thomas said. "I'm asking you as my friend, as someone who knew her, who knew me." Greg was quiet for a moment, then ran a hand over his face. "Okay, say I take a look. Where do we start?" Thomas hesitated, then reached for the journal. "Here." Greg flipped through the pages, brows furrowed. "This guy sounds unstable. Maybe, or maybe he saw what I'm seeing." Greg didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone. "I've got access to the old files. Let me see if anything jumps." He scrolled in silence for a while, eyes narrowing. Then, "This is weird." "What?" "There was a witness, brief mention. A neighbor said she saw Emily the day she disappeared, running down the street toward the church, but it was dismissed. No follow-up." Thomas felt his heart skip. "That was never in the reports I saw." "It wouldn't be. Back then they didn't digitize half the witness statements." He stood, pacing slowly. "And get this, there was another case. A woman went missing in the 70s, said to be mentally unstable. Last seen heading toward this church. Nothing ever came of it." Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would that be in Emily's file?" "It's not. I searched the church address." They locked eyes. The silence between them weighted with a truth neither wanted to name. Greg shoved his phone in his pocket. "All right, I'll poke around discreetly. But Thomas, if we find something, we might not like what it means." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'd rather face the truth than live in silence." Greg turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You still have that picture of her? Emily?" Thomas crossed the room, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small frame. A girl with a bright smile and a dimpled chin beamed back at them. Greg stared at it for a long moment, then looked up. "I remember that smile," he said quietly. "If she's still out there, we owe it to her to find out." Chicago felt like another world, louder, colder, impatient. The wind cut through Father Thomas's coat as he stepped out of the train station. He hadn't told Helen or Greg where he was going, only that it was urgent. He carried the journal in his bag, wrapped tightly in cloth. He found the convent tucked between modern buildings, a relic of the past shrouded in ivy and silence. The Sisters of the Holy Intercession rarely allowed visitors, but a priest's call had earned him a meeting, with someone the diocese had long since stopped listening to. They led him down a quiet corridor to a room with a wooden cross and 2 chairs. There, waiting in silence, sat Sister Agatha. Her eyes were milky with age, but her posture was straight. Her hands, gnarled by arthritis, rested calmly on her lap. She did not greet him with pleasantries. "You've heard her," she said. Thomas didn't pretend otherwise. Yes, she tilted her head. When? About a week ago. It started with a voice, then wax, then her name, Emily. The old nun nodded slowly. The girl in white. Thomas froze. You've seen her. I did, many years ago. Before I left Indiana, before they silenced me. He placed the journal on the table, opening to the entry she once inspired. You knew Father Bennett. I warned him, she said. He didn't listen. He tried to cast her out like a demon, but she wasn't evil. Then what is she? A fragment, she said. A soul caught in the thin space between here and there, and the church. It's the wound she leaks through. Thomas's mouth went dry. She's my sister. Sister Agatha looked at him for a long moment. Then it was always meant to be you. He leaned forward. Why is this happening now? Because faith is weakest when silence rules, and pain long buried becomes power. Something has held her there, Father, something stronger than grief. Something that feeds on it. Thomas frowned. You're saying this isn't just her? She was taken by something that thrives in sacred places, cracked by doubt. It binds her, uses her presence to stir fear. The more you see her, the closer you are to that wound. He rubbed his temples, the weight of her words pressing into his bones. How do I free her? The nun's expression darkened. You must be willing to lose everything. Your reputation, your clarity, your very soul. Only complete surrender, complete faith can break the bond. Thomas looked down. I've been a priest for 17 years. I've baptized, married, buried people, but I've never felt further from God. Agatha reached out, her cold fingers curling over his hand. Then you're exactly where you need to be. A long silence followed, broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock. Before he left, she said one last thing. If you go further down this path, Father, you may find her. But be warned, whatever has kept her hidden won't let go easily. It will test you, it will lie, and it will make you doubt the only thing that can save her. He nodded. Outside, the wind howled louder than before, but inside him something had shifted. He didn't have clarity, but he had purpose, and he was done being afraid of the questions. Back at the train station, he pulled out his phone and saw a new message from Greg. Need to talk, found something urgent, the timing felt too exact. He boarded the train without replying, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the glass. Whatever waited back in Indiana, he knew now. He wasn't just facing the past, he was walking straight into a battle for something far greater. The morning he returned to St. Jude's, the church was different, brighter somehow, though the skies outside were heavy with snow. As Father Thomas stepped through the doors, a strange hush settled around him, not the usual silence of an empty sanctuary, but something deeper, expectant. He walked to the altar, pausing beneath the statue of the Virgin Mary. He hadn't looked at her closely in days, not since the name appeared in wax. But now something was wrong. Moisture streaked her cheeks. At first he thought it was a trick of condensation or perhaps a leak. He climbed the short steps and reached out, running a finger beneath one of the streaks. It was wet, clear. He touched it to his tongue. Salt. Tears. He staggered back, heart hammering. No. Within the hour, word had spread. A teenager had seen him rush from the church and posted a vague message online. By noon, curious townspeople were gathering. By late afternoon, the local news had arrived. By evening, the church was full. Dozens of candles flickered. The scent of incense clung to every surface. People knelt, some weeping, some praying, others just watching, desperate for proof of something beyond themselves. And the statue still wept. Thomas stood off to the side, dizzy from the sheer presence of it all. Helen found him in the sacristy, her voice low but steady. You didn't fake this, did you? He turned sharply. You really think I would? No, she said gently, but I had to ask, because the world will. He exhaled, his hands trembling. I don't know what to do. Then start by doing what you always have, she said. Lead them. He nodded slowly and stepped back into the sanctuary. The murmurs died down as he approached the altar. "I don't know what's happening here," he said, "but if this is real, then it's not about spectacle. It's not about fame. It's about faith. It's about remembering why we come here at all." He knelt, and the people followed. For the first time in years, St. Jude's was alive. That night, after the church emptied, Helen stayed behind to help him clean. They worked in silence until he spoke. "I met someone, a nun, in Chicago." Helen glanced up. "A mystic?" "Something like that. She told me Emily isn't lost, she's trapped, and something is keeping her that way." Helen set down the candle she was holding. "Then we have to help her." Thomas hesitated. "It might cost us more than we think." "I've already lost a child," she said. "You think I'd walk away now?" He looked at her, seeing not just a friend, but a warrior in her own right, wounded, but standing. As they finished, he turned toward the statue once more. The tears were gone. But in their place, something else. A small white flower, fresh, impossibly so, lay at the base of the pedestal. Thomas picked it up, staring at its perfect petals. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. "That wasn't there before." He nodded. They stood in silence as snow fell outside, and the world waited for its next sign. But Thomas no longer needed proof. He had seen the first miracle, and it was only the beginning. The snow fell heavier the next morning, blanketing the streets in silence. Inside the rectory, Father Thomas sat at the kitchen table, turning a worn rosary between his fingers. He hadn't slept. The flower, the tears, the people, all of it was pulling him deeper into something ancient and buried. Helen sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee, eyes red-rimmed but alert. "We need to try something different," she said softly. Thomas looked up, wary. "Like what? You said you don't remember the day Emily disappeared. Not really. You've told me that before, but maybe it's not lost, just locked." He frowned. "You're talking about regression. I know a therapist in Bloomington. She's discreet, and she's good." Thomas hesitated. "That's dangerous. What if I remember something I can't live with?" Helen reached across the table and took his hand. "And what if it helps you save her?" An hour later, they were on the road, driving through flurries that blurred the horizon. The therapist, Dr. Celeste Harding, welcomed them without questions. Her office was warm, dimly lit, with thick rugs and soft music humming in the background. Thomas lay back in the recliner, fingers still gripping the rosary. Celeste's voice guided him gently, steadily into that space between memory and silence. "Tell me where you are," she whispered. His voice came slow, uncertain. "St. Jude's. It's summer, late afternoon. Emily's laughing. She's wearing a blue dress. She's teasing me about something." "What do you see next?" Thomas's brow furrowed. "We're outside the church. She's running. I'm yelling at her to slow down. I'm supposed to be watching her." He shifted in the chair, breath catching. "She's scared. Something spooked her. A man... no, a figure. I can't see the face. She runs into the church. And you?" "I follow. It's dark inside. She's crying. I hear her calling my name." He began to tremble. "I get to the altar. She's not there. Just... gone. No sound. No footsteps. No doors, like she vanished into air." Celeste leaned in. "Do you feel anything else?" He swallowed. "Cold. Sharp. Like the air doesn't want me there. And something... watching." A tear slipped down his cheek. She was taken. But not by a person. It wasn't human. The room grew silent. Celeste gently brought him back, her voice soft. When his eyes opened, they were filled with pain and something more, certainty. Back at the rectory, Helen poured him a glass of water. "What did you see?" "She didn't run from someone," he said, voice hoarse. "She was pulled in, into something invisible. The church swallowed her." Helen's hand trembled slightly. "You really believe it?" "I felt it, like the walls closed in." Like faith itself cracked open. A long pause settled between them. Then Thomas whispered, "I think the Virgin tried to intervene, but something stopped her." Helen blinked. What could stop the Mother of God? He looked up, haunted. Despair. Outside, the snow fell in thick silence. Inside, a memory once buried now bled into the present. And Thomas knew. If he wanted to reach Emily, he'd have to descend into the heart of where it all began. The snow had stopped by the time Father Thomas returned to St. Jude's. The sky was the color of slate, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. He stood in front of the church's thick wooden doors, hands trembling slightly, as if the building itself were watching him. Inside, the silence welcomed him like a waiting host. He moved with purpose, crossing the nave and heading toward the back hallway where the boiler room door stood. Few parishioners ever ventured back there. Fewer still knew there was anything beneath it. Greg arrived minutes later, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" Thomas nodded. "I remembered something during the regression. There's a basement, one no one talks about. It was sealed when I was a kid. I think Emily's last step led there." Greg folded his arms. "That part of the building hasn't been opened in decades. It's not on the plans." "I know," Thomas said quietly, "but it's there." Helen joined them, flashlight in hand. "If we're doing this, let's do it." Together they descended the narrow staircase behind the sacristy. The air grew colder with each step. The stone walls narrowed. The light dimmed. Dust floated thick as smoke. At the bottom, they found it. A door, wooden, blackened, reinforced with rusted iron bands. Across its surface were carvings, symbols Thomas recognized from old exorcism texts. Crosses, saints' initials, Latin invocations etched deeply as if to restrain whatever lay behind. He ran his fingers along one inscription, Fiat voluntas tua. "Let thy will be done," he whispered. Greg tested the handle. "It's locked." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a brass key, the one he'd found inside the old priest's journal, taped to the last page. He inserted it into the lock. It turned. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded too human. Behind it, darkness. Greg shined his flashlight inside, revealing a narrow tunnel lined with damp stone. The air was heavy with rot and cold. They stepped inside. The path curved, descending deeper into the earth. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the tunnel were larger than it seemed. Walls whispered with moisture. The only warmth came from the rosary clutched in Thomas's hand. After several minutes, they emerged into a circular chamber. The floor was stone, cracked. The ceiling arched into darkness. In the center stood an altar, primitive, older than the church itself, and above it, embedded into the far wall, was a niche, empty, but stained with wax, dried flowers, and soot. Greg swept the flashlight across the space. "What the hell is this place?" "A holding ground," Thomas murmured. "Sister Agatha said some churches were built on broken places, thin spots between worlds. This is one of them." Helen moved toward the altar, stopping suddenly. "There's something here," she said. "A presence." Thomas felt it too, a shift in the air. A whisper not heard, but felt, like breath on the back of the neck. Then, from the far corner of the room, a soft sound, a voice, calling his name. "Thomas." He turned toward it, chest tight. The voice was familiar, childlike, trembling. It came from behind a smaller door, half hidden, half rotted, nestled into the stone. He stepped toward it. Greg grabbed his arm. "We need to be careful." Thomas nodded, but he already knew. Behind that door was the answer he'd waited a lifetime for. Whether it brought salvation or damnation, he couldn't turn away now. Thomas pushed the rotting door open with slow, deliberate hands. It creaked loudly, resisting as if trying to keep its secret sealed just a little longer. Cold air spilled out from the chamber beyond, sharp and still. The room was small, circular, its walls made of stone, darker than the rest. Faint carvings, symbols and Latin phrases covered every surface. The floor was covered in layers of old wax, dried flowers, bits of rosaries long broken. A stillness filled the space that went beyond silence. It was the kind of stillness that made the soul brace for something it couldn't see. Helen stepped in behind Thomas, flashlight trembling in her hand. Greg followed, jaw clenched, hand resting on his holstered sidearm. Then they saw her. She stood near the back wall, small and pale, facing the altar. Her hair was long, brown, tangled. She wore a white dress, clean, unstained, as if time had never touched it. Her back remained to them, unmoving. Thomas's voice cracked. "Emily." The girl turned slowly. Her face hadn't changed. Still 9. Still delicate. Still hers. "Thomas," she whispered. He dropped to his knees. Helen gasped softly, tears brimming in her eyes. Greg just stood frozen, blinking like his brain couldn't keep up with what his eyes were seeing. Thomas crawled forward. "Is it really you?" Emily nodded, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I've been waiting." "For how long?" he asked, reaching out. But she took a step back. "Time doesn't work here. It feels like forever." He looked around. "What is this place?" "A place where lost things are kept," she said, "where forgotten prayers echo." Greg found his voice. "How are you alive?" "I don't know," she whispered. "One day I ran into the church, and the air changed. I felt pulled, like I was falling without moving, and then I was here. I couldn't leave. I tried. I screamed." Helen stepped forward, heart aching. "Why now?" "Why are we seeing you now?" "Because the cage is breaking," Emily said, eyes on her brother, "and something else is waking up, something that doesn't want me to leave." Thomas felt it too, a subtle shift in the air, like the chamber exhaled something that had been holding its breath. A low vibration began in the walls. The carvings around them pulsed faintly, glowing with light that wasn't natural. Greg reached for his gun. "We need to get her out now." Emily shook her head. "You can't just take me." "Why?" Thomas asked, panicked. "Because I'm not just me anymore." He froze. "What do you mean?" Emily's voice dropped. "There's something else. It hides behind the stone. It speaks in dreams. It fed on my fear until I forgot who I was. But when you came back, when you remembered me, it lost its hold." The chamber groaned softly. Thomas stood. "Then we're getting you out. We'll face whatever's here together." Emily looked at him, eyes wide and pleading. "It won't let me go easily." "I don't care." Helen reached for her. "Come with us, sweetheart, please." Emily hesitated, then stepped forward. That's when the room changed. The glow from the walls darkened, then pulsed red. A blast of cold erupted from the back wall. The symbols warped. The floor trembled. A voice, low, inhuman, ancient, whispered from the shadows. "She belongs to the silence now." Greg raised his weapon. "What the hell?" But Thomas stepped in front of Emily, arms outstretched. "No, she's mine." The air thickened, pressing down like invisible weight. Emily clutched her brother's hand. "If you believe in me, if you believe in what we were—" "I do," he whispered. "I always did." The pressure paused, just for a second, and that was enough. The chamber began to shift again, stone groaning, the darkness receding just slightly. They weren't free, not yet. But they had taken the first step, and something ancient wasn't happy. The chamber pulsed like a living heart, its walls breathing shadows. Father Thomas held Emily's trembling hand while Helen steadied the beam of her flashlight. Greg stood tense, weapon drawn, though the rational part of him knew a gun was useless here. The voice came again, deeper, vibrating in their bones. "She is mine. Her fear is the chain, her sorrow the key." "You cannot take her." Thomas's grip tightened. "You can't have her. She's my sister." The voice laughed, a hollow, cavernous sound. "You pray to silence, priest. You serve a God who let her be taken. Why give her back to you now?" Thomas's heart pounded, doubt clawing at him. His faith had already been fractured. Now it threatened to collapse. Emily's eyes searched his face, pleading. "Don't let go, Thomas, please." Greg cursed under his breath, scanning the chamber. "We can't stay here. This whole place feels like it's about to collapse." Helen stepped forward, Surprising them all, her voice was firm, almost defiant. "If something is holding her, then let it take me instead." Thomas spun on her. "No." Her jaw trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. "I lost my son. I wake every day with that emptiness. If this thing wants sorrow, then it has mine to feed on, not hers. She deserves a life." Emily shook her head violently. "No, that's not how it works." The walls trembled, dust raining from the ceiling. The voice hissed, pleased. "Yes, the woman knows grief. She would be strong enough to keep the door closed forever." Thomas stepped between Helen and the altar. "But you're not taking her place. If anyone surrenders, it's me." Helen's eyes widened. "Thomas." He raised a hand. "I'm her brother. It's my fault she ran that day. I should have protected her. If anyone pays the price, it's me." The chamber darkened, the oppressive weight growing heavier. Thomas fell to his knees, lifting his rosary. His voice trembled but grew stronger as he prayed. "Lord, I am not worthy, but if my life, my faith is the bridge, take it, let her go." Emily clutched his shoulders. "No, don't leave me again." Tears streamed down his face. "I never stopped looking for you, not one day, and I won't stop now." The symbols on the walls flared, glowing red, then white. The voice howled in fury. "You would give yourself? You would choose death over doubt?" Thomas cried out, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I choose faith." A violent wind roared around them, extinguishing Helen's flashlight. The chamber shook, as if the earth itself rejected his prayer. Thomas's body trembled, his chest burning as though his soul were being torn from him. But he clung tighter to Emily's hand. And then, the shift. The crushing weight lifted, the air brightened, the red glow receded into pure white. For the first time since stepping into the basement, Thomas felt warmth, not from himself, but from something greater. Emily gasped, her small hand steady in his. "It's letting go." The voice shrieked, retreating into the cracks of the stone. "This is not the end, priest." Faith fails. Despair returns, and then silence. The chamber grew still, filled only with their ragged breaths. Helen dropped to her knees beside them, tears streaking down her face. Greg lowered his weapon, shaken but silent. Thomas collapsed forward, drained, but alive. Emily knelt beside him, her small hands cupping his face. "You didn't leave me. You never left." His voice was weak but steady. "Never again." For the first time in decades, the weight of guilt in his chest began to lift. But deep inside, he knew this was not victory, it was only survival. And the true test had just begun. The silence after the voice vanished felt deafening, like the world had been scrubbed clean of sound. Father Thomas knelt in the chamber, chest heaving, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. The rosary slipped from his fingers, clattering softly against the stone floor. Emily still clung to him, her small arms wrapped desperately around his neck. He could feel her heartbeat, steady, real, alive. Helen's sobs broke the stillness. She crouched beside them, brushing Emily's tangled hair back from her face. "She's here." "She's really here." Greg, ever the skeptic, stood back, pale and shaken. His voice cracked as he muttered, "I don't understand how... but she's not a ghost." Thomas lifted his head, forcing his gaze upward. The walls of the chamber, once carved with symbols that glowed with malice, now pulsed with faint golden light. The air was no longer heavy. Instead, it hummed with a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And then, something miraculous happened. The altar at the center of the chamber began to glow. The cracks in the stone filled with light, spreading like veins until the whole surface shimmered. The brightness expanded, washing across the walls, filling every crevice. For a moment, it was blinding. Helen shielded Emily's eyes, but Thomas stared straight into it, tears streaming freely. The warmth filled him, not just in his body, but in his spirit. For the first time since Emily vanished, he felt whole. The light swelled, surged, and then, like a great exhale, it burst upward through the cracks in the ceiling. They heard it travel, rumbling like thunder, racing toward the world above. And then, silence again, The chamber was no longer oppressive. It felt lighter, almost sanctified. Greg finally lowered his weapon, voice unsteady. I don't know what just happened." Thomas rose slowly, still clutching Emily's hand. "A miracle," he whispered. "That's what just happened." They made their way back through the tunnel, climbing the steps toward the sacristy. The church above greeted them with unexpected brightness. Candles flickered even though no one had lit them. The stained glass windows glowed with colors more vivid than Thomas had ever seen. At the altar, the statue of the Virgin Mary no longer wept. Instead, light seemed to radiate faintly from her stone face, serene and strong. Helen placed a hand on Thomas's arm. "Look around you." "The church, and it's alive again." He nodded. For years St. Jude's had been fading, empty pews, dwindling faith, forgotten prayers. But now it felt as though the building itself had been resurrected. Greg looked at Emily, still holding tightly to her brother. His voice was quieter than Thomas had ever heard. I owe you an apology. I thought you were losing it." "I thought this was grief playing tricks on you." Thomas placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You believed enough to come back. That's more than most would have done." Greg gave a small, reluctant nod, his skepticism shaken, but not fully gone. Yet Thomas could see something had shifted inside him. Emily looked up, her eyes wide. "I'm really here, aren't I?" Thomas crouched, cupping her face. "Yes, Emily, you're here and you're safe." She smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried shadows of the years she had been trapped. "It feels strange, like I never left. But I did." Helen embraced them both, her voice breaking. "You have your sister back. That's the kind of miracle people pray for their whole lives." Thomas looked again at the Virgin Mary's statue, his voice soft but resolute. Faith was tested here, and it returned stronger. For the first time in decades, hope had come back to St. Jude's, and yet, deep in his heart, Thomas knew the light had not erased the darkness entirely. It had only given them a moment to breathe before what came next. The snow had melted into slush by the time Sunday arrived. For the first time in years, the bells of St. Jude's rang with strength, their sound carrying through the small Indiana town like a call long forgotten. People came, more than Thomas had dared to expect, families bundled in coats, elderly parishioners leaning on canes, young faces curious but cautious. Inside, the church was alive. Candles flickered, incense curled upward in delicate threads, and sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows with a brilliance that felt almost deliberate. The pews filled, not with silence, but with voices, hushed, reverent, expectant. At the front, Father Thomas stood before the altar. His hands trembled as he adjusted his vestments, not out of fear, but out of awe. He glanced to the side. Helen sat with Emily, their hands intertwined, as if afraid to let go. Greg was there too, standing at the back, arms crossed, still skeptical, but present. When Thomas began to speak, his voice was low but steady. "For years this church has been fading. Our faith has felt weak, our prayers unanswered. But today we stand in the presence of something undeniable, not because of stone or statues, not because of miracles carved in marble or wax, but because we remembered what faith truly is." The congregation leaned in, hanging on his words. He continued, "Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the courage to believe even when doubt is louder. Faith is not proof, it is trust. And when we choose it, when we live it, we make room for the impossible." His eyes moved across the pews, landing finally on Emily. She smiled faintly, her small frame almost swallowed by the heavy coat Helen had wrapped her in. "I once lost someone I loved," Thomas said, his voice faltering before it steadied again. "For years I carried that loss as guilt. I believed I had failed. But what I learned is this: love never dies. It waits, and when faith is strong enough, love finds its way back." A ripple of quiet emotion moved through the congregation. Heads bowed, hands clasped, tears glistened. After the Mass ended, the people lingered, whispering prayers, lighting candles, touching the statue of the Virgin Mary with trembling fingers. For the first time in decades, St. Jude's was not just a building, it was a heartbeat. Greg approached Thomas near the altar, his voice gruff. Still don't know what to make of any of this, but I can't deny what I saw down there. What we all saw. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes we're not meant to understand, just to witness. Greg gave a small reluctant nod, then glanced at Emily. She's tougher than both of us. Emily laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. For Thomas, it was the most sacred hymn he had ever heard. Later, as the church emptied, Thomas remained by the altar. Helen joined him, her expression calm but firm. You gave them hope again, and you gave me something too. What's that? He asked. She smiled. Proof that love can heal even the deepest wound. Thomas looked once more at the statue of the Virgin Mary. The tears were gone, replaced with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. This was not the end of the story, but it was a beginning. He turned to Emily, who was waiting at the pew, her small hands clasped in prayer. For the first time since she disappeared, his heart felt whole. And as he closed the church doors that evening, the whisper came again. Soft, gentle, no longer a plea, but a blessing. Well done, Thomas. If this story moved your soul, subscribe now and join us for more true spiritual journeys. And don't stop here. Click the video on your screen for another haunting story of faith, loss, and redemption.